Hey, everybody. Welcome. It's time for True Crime Wednesday. If you haven't been with us before, welcome. My name is Lori Hellis, and I'm a retired criminal attorney writing a book about the Vallow case. And we talk all things true crime. We focus a lot on Vallow because that's what I am up to my eyebrows in right now. But there are a lot of other true crime cases to visit about. So we'll just chat for a couple of minutes while we wait for folks to join us, but welcome. We are going to talk tonight about several different cases, a few small developments and a couple of bigger developments in a few of the cases. So we'll talk about those things. I'm a quilter. You can see my quilt grids back here. I always do this backwards. And we have done a True Crime Quilt Guild quilt. We've wrapped that up, but I've got another project I'm thinking about doing, and I'll be filling you in on that as we go along, probably in the next couple weeks. So maybe we'll just dive right in. I would like to talk, first of all, about the case of Lindsay Shiver. If y'all haven't heard about this case, it's pretty interesting. Lindsay Shiver is a beauty queen, cheerleader, graduate from Auburn University. She married the star football player from Auburn University. He then went pro for some fairly short period of time before getting into the insurance business, where he was quite successful. He comes from a very wealthy family in Georgia, and they were living the dream, living the high life. They lived in a $2.5 million mansion. They had $1 million vacation property in the Bahamas, and they have three little boys, and life was good, flying around on his parents' private jet, and seemed like life was pretty good. But she began spending a lot of time at their vacation home in the Bahamas, and he got a little bit suspicious. So he hired a private investigator, and the private investigator determined that Lindsay was hanging out at a beachside bar called Grabbers, of all things, and actually had struck up a relationship with a man who worked at the bar, whose name was Terrence Bethel. Now, I happen to have a little bit of insight about the Bahamas in general, and I'll share that with you in a minute. But so Lindsay had taken up with Mr. Bethel, who was a few years younger than her, and her husband got wind of it and decided to file for divorce. And they were in the midst of a very ugly custody battle and what was going to prove to be a really ugly, heavily contested divorce. Well, police in the Bahamas were investigating a robbery or a burglary, I should probably say, a burglary at Grabber's Bar, and discovered a bunch of text messages on Mr. Bethel's telephone. And those text messages were between Lindsay and another man and Mr. Bethel. And they all had to do with murdering Lindsay's husband next time he was in the Bahamas. So it was a murder for hire plot. The police uncovered it before it happened. Mr. Shiver is just fine living in Georgia with his 3 children. And Lindsay and her paramour and the potential assassin were arrested and flown from an outer island in the Bahamas to Nassau. where they were housed in the absolutely notorious Fox Hill prison. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about how I know all these things. My husband's sister has lived in the Bahamas for most of her adult life. While she was a flight attendant, she met a man who lived and worked, and his family were from the Bahamas, and they married, and she has spent her whole adult life in the Bahamas. And so we have visited there many times, been to many of the islands, and we know a fair amount of folks who live in the Bahamas. Bethel is a fairly common name in the Bahamas. And so it's sort of interesting that Mr. Bethel is part of this conspiracy. And it's interesting that they all ended up at Fox Hill Prison. Now, Fox Hill Prison has to be one of the most deplorable third world prisons that you could imagine. There's no sanitation. You use a bucket. It is ugly. Oftentimes, the personnel there are they don't get great food. People can bring food to their loved ones if they happen to be in Fox Hill Prison. But the food doesn't always make its way to your loved one. It often ends up making its way into the bellies of the guards. There's a lot of graft and corruption in the prison, and it is notoriously a place you do not want to be. It's just basically a concrete blockhouse with open windows at the top. There's no air circulation, let alone any air conditioning. There's no air circulation. There's no insect control. There is absolutely nothing that would be a creature comfort at Fox Hill. And in fact, people who are from other parts of the country and who are awaiting extradition in the Bahamas always waive extradition and try and get out of there absolutely as fast as they can. So it's fascinating to me that this sweet, rich cheerleader, TikTok soccer mom ended up in Fox Hill. She actually had to spend a couple of extra days in Fox Hill before she was released today on an ankle monitor. Her co-defendants had been released on bond and with ankle monitors, but she had to wait for hers. The other thing is that the charges are in the Bahamas. They are not U.S. charges. So she is not going to be extradited to the U.S. She is required to remain in the Bahamas as long as the charges are pending. She was allowed to go to a rental home on New Providence, which is where Nassau is, island. But she is not allowed to leave the Bahamas, and she will be there until her case is adjudicated. And then undoubtedly will be going back to Fox Hill. So interesting case. And when I heard she was in jail in the Bahamas, it just sent shivers up my spine. So it will be interesting to see what the outcome is. Now, the Bahamas was a British colony, so they follow British common law, which is slightly different than U.S. Criminal law. But as I said, the Bahamas is also notorious for, in a lot of ways, being a third world country. They gained their independence from Britain. They have a nominally independent government, but there is an incredible amount of corruption and graft. And so it will be interesting to see how that plays into whether or not Lindsay Shiver gets convicted and whether or not she ends up spending time in prison over there. So that one's one I'm going to keep my eye on, because it just so happens that I have some connections in the Bahamas. We're actually traveling there in November to attend a family wedding. So I'm really interested to hear what our family members have to say about this case, and whether or not they know Mr. Bethel, and whether or not they were aware of some of the other people who've been involved in the case. So interesting. I also wanted to talk about Ashley Pearson. Ashley Pearson is a young mom who was accused of murdering her abusive boyfriend. And this was a stand your ground case. She was alleged to have been in a home with her significant other who had a long history of being abusive. He had been designated as a violent offender. She actually, at the time that this incident happened, still had her jaw wired because he'd broken it for the second time. So there's no question that she was in an abusive relationship, that he was violent, that she was fearful of him. There had also recently been an instance where he had been abusive to her young child. She had a toddler from a previous relationship, and her abuser was somewhat jealous of the child and angry whenever the child cried. And so there was some evidence presented that he had been abusive to the child as well when she cried. They got into a confrontation. He had been drinking. He actually had been out with his mother earlier in the evening drinking. He was intoxicated. And he confronted her in the kitchen, grabbed her head, slammed it against the counter, and then the baby started to cry, and he headed for the baby's room. She then said, "I grabbed the first thing handy and threw it at him." And it turned out to be a knife, and it turned out that it was embedded in his chest. And she rushed into the baby's room to comfort the baby and to make sure that she was in bed. And when she came back, she realized he was staggering and falling to the floor. And when she pulled up his shirt, she realized that he'd been stabbed. She then called his mother, who called 911. Actually, she had texted his mother and said, "Call 911 because he's on the rampage." And when the police arrived, he was not in good shape and actually died shortly after. So it was interesting because the district attorney, this happened about 4 years ago, and the district attorney that was at the time in office declined to prosecute her. Later, a new district attorney took over and went forward with the prosecution. And so today there was a hearing on whether or not there was a stand your ground hearing, essentially on whether or not she had acted in self-defense. And the judge went through and did a lot of findings about the fact that it was very clear that the man was violent, that he had a lengthy history of abusing her, that the judge found all of that information credible, and determined that she was in fact entitled to stand her ground and dismiss the case. So an interesting outcome. Certainly these stand your ground laws vary from state to state, and their state Supreme Courts interpret them differently. I believe this was Florida, but I can't give you a specific. So I thought that was very interesting. And as somebody who represented a lot of women in restraining order hearings, represented a lot of women in those sorts of situations, it was a little encouraging, I think. So Rex Heuermann, who has been charged with 3 murders in that are related to the Long Island serial killer, was compelled today to give a DNA sample. The prosecution had asked for him to give a cheek swab. He had declined. They filed a motion. The defense objected, and the court said there was probable cause to suspect that he was involved in the 3 murders that he is charged with, and signed a court order saying that he could be compelled to give a cheek swab. So that will happen, and they will move forward with that case. Now, you might remember that they were able to obtain his DNA from pizza crusts that were thrown into the trash outside his office in Manhattan, and I think also a cup. And so this just being sure that they've got a cheek swab from him when they can identify the chain of custody and make sure that they, in fact, have the right person they're swabbing, just reinforces their case. So, and then we have a little Alec Murdaugh news. You might recall that Alec Murdaugh, these cases are pretty inextricably linked because of all the financial crimes and the fact that the prosecutor in the murder case made the case that that Maggie and Paul's awareness of what perhaps Alec was doing, as well as his desire to take the focus off of him and garner sympathy, were the motives for the murder. So one of the things that came up at the murder trial that also has come up related to all of the civil trials having to do with all of the money he stole was the Satterfield case. The Satterfield was the Gloria Satterfield was their housekeeper and really had been the person who raised the Murdaugh boys, Buster and Paul. And she fell down the stairs at their Moselle property, which was their hunting property where the murders also took place. Sorry, I'm getting hoarse already. So Alec Murdaugh told his insurance company that his dogs had knocked her off balance and that it was his dogs who were responsible for her fall. And ultimately, she hit her head and several weeks later died from her injuries. So Alec told his insurance company his dogs were responsible for it, and then made a claim against his homeowner's insurance. And the Satterfields collected, well, the insurance company settled, let's put it that way, for $3 million. Alec never told the Satterfield sons that they had received that kind of a settlement. And the Satterfields never got any money out of the settlement. In fact, Alec misappropriated that money and to his own uses. So then what happened was Alec, in the litigation against Alec's law firm for not supervising him and not keeping track of his settlements, and also the bank, who had been complicit in keeping the money away from the Satterfield boys, they settled with the Satterfields, and the Satterfields recovered actually more than they would have recovered than they got in the settlement. That was because the law firm and the bank were settling and admitting liability. So as part of that, Alec Murdaugh also signed a confession of judgment saying, yes, I stole your money. Yes, I owe it to you. And he did that as a part of trying to make himself look better during the criminal trial, that he was repentant for having stole millions from the Satterfield sons. And so after the criminal trial was over and he was sentenced to life in prison, there are all these other cases that are still out there. There are cases having to do with his malfeasance and there are also cases still having to do with the boat crash that Paul Murdaugh was involved in. And one girl died in the boat crash. So her parents have sued on a wrongful death suit. It's a very convoluted trial or case that has hundreds of tentacles that go out all over the South Carolina Lowcountry, because Alec Murdaugh's family were 4 generations of law enforcement. They were all prosecutors and lawyers, and so they had a tremendous amount of power in the South Carolina Lowcountry. So Alec Murdaugh, after his trial was over, asked the judge to set aside that satisfaction, that confession of judgment, where he agreed that he was liable to repay the Satterfield sons. And what he did it based on the claiming that the Satterfield sons had already been made more than whole. They'd already gotten more than they would have gotten had they actually received the insurance proceeds from Alec's homeowner's insurance. And that so they sort of took the position, well, you've already been paid, so no harm, no foul. Well, that's really not what was going on. You don't relieve the malfeasant, the malactor, the bad guy, of any responsibility because somebody else paid the bill. They were able to make the case that Alec's law firm owed a duty, a fiduciary duty to the Satterfield sons to make sure that their funds were being responsibly handled, and that the bank who allowed Alec to deposit those funds and to draw them back out knew that they were ill-gotten and they should not have allowed Alec to misappropriate them. So the basis for the Satterfield sons recovering from the bank and the law firm had absolutely nothing to do with whether or not the Satterfields retained a right to recover what Alec had stolen. So hopefully that description makes sense, that explanation makes sense. Because after the trial was over, Alec said, oh, no harm, no foul. They've been made whole and gotten more than they would have gotten had I paid them back. So I shouldn't have to pay them back. And the judge today denied that motion and said, nope, sorry, I'm not going to void that confession of judgment. You owe the money. So that was a great step in the right direction. For any of you who are the least bit interested in the Murdaugh case, definitely check out Mandy Matney's podcasts. She has done a masterful job. She's been on this case since the very beginning, before even the boat crash. because she believed that the Murdaughs were into some shady stuff. And she is a reporter from the South Carolina Lowcountry. She's kind of gone out on her own now, has her own media company, and she's done a masterful job at keeping track of and summing up what's going on in the Murdaugh case. She's now branched out. The podcast used to be called the Murdaugh Murders Podcast. And she has now branched out and is looking at some other cases now that Murdaugh is threatening to wrap up. And so her podcast is now called True Sunlight. And they have a companion podcast that they do with Eric Bland, who is an attorney who was representing the Satterfield sons and some of the other financial victims of Alec Murdaugh's. And that podcast is called Cup of Justice. And I highly recommend both of them. I think they have done a wonderful job, and it is a very complex case. So Mandy is starting to branch out and to look at some other cases down in the South. Her biggest complaint has been the Good Old Boy Network and the corruption that is happening in South Carolina, in the courts and in law enforcement. So her podcasts are definitely worth a listen. So that brings us to brings us to Lori Vallow. Boy. So I do want to draw your attention to a couple of great episodes of Pretty Lies and Alibis with Gigi McKelvey. She's done a little bit of a deep dive into what prison is going to be like for Lori. She has someone that she knows who is a woman who is in the California prison system and is a lifer there. And so she has been talking to her about what can a woman expect going to prison. And I think they're both really good episodes. But so I want to talk a little bit about that. So I have been to state prisons, and I don't care what you say, they're not tennis camps. They're not daycare or camp, sleepaway camp. They're rough places. So what we know is there are fewer female inmates who are there for violent offenses, and fewer of them who are likely to create the kind of disruption, probably be a good word, that happens in the male side of prisons. So we do have a lot of, we have fewer of those lockdowns, we have fewer of those beat downs. And so in general, women's prison tends to be slightly, oh so slightly, less rigid than the men's prisons. But I'm here to tell you that it is no picnic. First of all, you live communally with other women 24/7. And that's rough. It takes a lot of adjusting to. There are no cushy situations in the women's prison. It is not a place where you really want to be for the rest of your life. Now, a lot of people say, oh, but they get commissary and they get a TV and yeah, that's true. But if you listen to Gigi, she'll tell you about how they obtain those things. If they want to have a, a tablet that has limited capability to send emails, to look at video programs, they have to buy it. And that costs around $100. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot, except that these are folks that are making $10 a month, $20 a month at best. Gigi's friend is, I wouldn't say she's a friend, but Gigi's acquaintance is in one of the best paying jobs in the prison. She gets $100 a month. However, all but $10 a month of that goes back out to be paid in restitution and court fees. So she's got a long way to go before she's going to earn her way out to the point where she'll actually get $100 a month. Several years, I think. So it's not that easy. The other thing is that if family members put money on your books so that you can have those little creature comforts, a portion of that immediately gets taken as restitution as well. So you don't get everything your family puts, or your friends or your loved ones put on your books. You don't get all that money, and it's not available to you. So once the inmate has been there long enough to build up a little interest in their commissary and has paid some of their fees, they may be able to have enough money in their commissary to buy snack foods, to buy one pair of shoes a year, to buy a baseball cap if they're going to be out in the yard in the sun, to buy basic necessities, hygiene items, and they might still have a little left over and be able to rent a video or a movie that they can watch on their tablet. They also have the ability to purchase a television, a small, like, portable TV that they can keep in their cell. But that takes several $100s. And in order to get there, they've got to have somebody put that money on their books and put enough money on their books that they can still afford it after money's been taken from them for their restitution. So it's not a simple system. It's not going to be easy. And Lori is going to be a high visibility inmate. And that means that she's going to take a lot of verbal abuse, a lot of physical abuse, although, she'll get roughed up. Will she get a beat down like they would in male prison? Doubt it. But she is going to get roughed up. And she is going to have to toe the line, and she is going to have to follow the rules. And as many rules as there are in prison, there are more unwritten social rules. And so she's going to have to learn how to get along with all those other women. Now, one of the things that they say is it's always good to have a skill that you can share. And Lori's a hairdresser. So she may be able to parlay that into some friendships and maybe some protection. It is not as pressing or as necessary to line up protection the way it is in male prison. In male prisons, you have to line up, and there are cultural and ethnic gangs in the prisons. So if you are Black, you need to figure out whether you are a Crip or a Blood. If you are white, you need to figure out whether you are going to line up with one of the white supremacist gangs that are in prison. And likewise, if you happen to be Hispanic, you've got to figure out whether or not you're going to line up with any of those. And usually lining up with a prison gang also means that you have a prison gang job. And that could be going around collecting extortion money. It could be going around and muling drugs that are snuck into the prison. And believe me, there are drugs in prison. It's not all just Pruno, which is making alcoholic substances out of foodstuffs. There are a lot of drugs in prison. It is an ongoing issue, and an issue that prisons are constantly battling against. So it is not going to be an easy transition for her. While she was in the Fremont County Jail, it was a much smaller jail. For at least some of that period of time, she was in a pod all by herself. She was able to communicate with family. Now she'll be able to have phone calls and those sort of things, but a lot of it's going to hinge on how quickly she's going to be able to afford to get a tablet, because she doesn't have one that she owns now. At least I don't think so. And then there's the question of whether or not anything she has could be compatible with what she is in the Pocatello prison anyway. So we know that Fremont County, the food service for Fremont County, all the food's homemade, and it's a very small jail. So, or Madison County is where she is. Very small jail, very small women's section. And so the food was pretty good. She's going to get there and discover the food is horrible. The food is barely nominally edible. And that's what they're stuck with. And it's a lot of carbs. It's a lot of, and so what happens is they are then forced to try and figure out how to get snack foods out of the commissary. So if they don't have money on their books, they trade to people who do. So Lori could be trading services doing hair in return for goodies from the commissary. So it will be interesting to see how she's how she adjusts. The other thing that Gigi pointed out, which I had heard before, is that when you go in as a person who is going in for life, the first thing they do is they go through everything that you bring with them, which may be the clothes you came in anything that they took from you at the time that you were arrested. And they say, you can't have any of this. What do you want to do with it? And usually it means they just throw it all in the trash. Or they're able to, or the person is able to donate them. It may be possible that she may be able to give some of those things to family members. I don't know what she brought with her, but she's not allowed to have anything that isn't prison issue for the rest of her life. She's going to get one pair of outdoor shoes and little slip-on rubber jellies that she wears around the prison. And she's going to get a coat for when it's cold and they're outside. And she's going to have a prison job. And that's going to be her life. So I don't know that it would be really fair to say, hey, she's in the cushy women's prison, because in my experience, no prison is cushy. So the other thing that has come up is that Arizona has now filed for her to be extradited to Arizona. Rumor has it that she's really terrified of going to, she would be held once again in jail in Maricopa County, which is a large jail and is going to be much more, is going to be a much rougher and more difficult population. That's a much rougher, more violent, more difficult population. Just a bigger, I mean, there's 7 million people in the Phoenix area. And so the cross section of prisoners who are in prison or in jail waiting trial and on short-term sentences is just a rougher crowd. So rumor has it she's pretty nervous about that. One of the things that they're asking for is that they're asking she be extradited. Extradition is a very complex area of the law. And the reason for that is because we have a 14th Amendment to our Constitution, which gives every state sovereignty. So because of that, Arizona can't tell Idaho what to do. Sorry, I'm slipping down on my chair and I need to check my hip. Arizona can't tell Idaho what to do. So they have to ask, can we please have this prisoner who we have probable cause to believe committed a crime in our state, can we please have that person sent to us so we can prosecute them? And what it takes is Maricopa County in the Phoenix area filed a request and a petition for extradition, and that has to go to Idaho to the governor. So it actually is one of the rare things that are actually done governor to governor from state to state. What that means is Idaho's governor has to release and give permission for Lori to be extradited. Now, because you might remember when she was in Hawaii and the state of Idaho said, we want her extradited back to Hawaii, she was able to waive extradition. That was a different circumstance because she was only under arrest and accused. She was not convicted. Now that she's convicted and sentenced, she really is the property of Idaho. She is in their custody. She is in the custody permanently of the Department of Corrections of the state of Idaho. So in order for Arizona to get Lori back there, they need to get the permission of the Idaho governor. Now, I'm certain that that will happen, but it is a process. And that process takes sometimes months. So Lori doesn't really know when she is going to be sent to Arizona. If she's fortunate, it is going to be after the summer's over, because as far as I know, Arizona jails aren't air conditioned, and it has been in the 110, 115 range in Arizona all summer. So if she's fortunate, she is going to be able to wait until the weather is a little cooler before she gets shipped off to Arizona. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. But it is going to take some time. In the meantime, she is going through the orientation and the what do they call it? The first month that you're in prison, they go through a bunch of assessments. They assess your physical health, your mental health. They make sure, your dental. They do all of those assessments. They figure out where you should be housed, whether or not you have some sort of special needs. Do you need to be on a mental health unit? Do you need to be in a unit where you can get drug and alcohol treatment? All of those assessments are done early in that first orientation and introductory phase. And people sometimes wait weeks or maybe even months before they are processed fully and they are sent. And that processing happens in the order that they're received. So they're kind of in a queue, and they have to wait until it's their turn in line to go through that process. So it could happen in a month, or it could be several months before she's actually put into a permanent housing unit into general population. We don't know whether or not they're going to immediately put her into general population, because we don't know whether they're going to assess a security risk for her, meaning they're concerned that she's not safe in prison. It's more likely in the male prison than it is in the women's prison, but I understand that a lot of those women who are in prison are mothers. So she's going to face some pretty steep hazing, pretty steep opposition, I think. There have been a lot of questions about the charges in Arizona, so let me just address that. We don't actually know for certain what the charges are in Arizona. We know, we have seen the indictment for Brandon Boudreaux's charges. And we know that at that point, she was being charged with conspiracy to commit murder for Brandon's indictment. We also know that there was an initial charge for conspiracy to commit murder for Charles. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The information that is coming out of Arizona is limited because it appears that those documents were sealed and they haven't necessarily been unsealed yet. So when I look up the case number, all I see is a kind of a blank screen, really. It doesn't have a lot of information in it. It says the assistant DA that's assigned to the case. It doesn't tell me what the charges are. It doesn't tell me the name of the defendant. Nothing is there. So we're waiting to see what that outcome is going to be. Now, we did see, and Justin Lum posted on his Twitter feed, that there was a notice that in the request for extradition that listed the charges as murder in the first degree. So we don't know whether the state of Arizona has supplemented or increased the charges having to do with Charles, of course. So we don't know the answer to that yet. It's possible that they are going to upgrade the charges. So a lot of people have asked about how the situation works between Arizona and Idaho. And it is interesting. In Arizona, conspiracy to commit murder is not a death penalty eligible crime. It carries a life in prison sentence with a possibility of parole after 25 years. It's not death penalty eligible. Now, murder in the first degree is death penalty eligible. So if the state of Arizona has upgraded the charges, they could very well be seeking the death penalty. And that decision may have to do with the fact that the death penalty came off the table in Idaho. I don't know. We know that prosecutors and law enforcement have been talking to one another since the very beginning of this case. I have recently been going through all of the Arizona discovery from both Chandler and Gilbert. And it's very evident that law enforcement and the prosecution team have been talking to each other for years now. So we don't really know what the ultimate charges are going to be for Lori. If they charge her with the death penalty and she is found guilty and the jury recommends the death penalty during the penalty phase, then that would be a different question about which state would take priority. In general, the state with the first conviction has priority. And so we're waiting to see. I think it's going to depend on what the final sentences are in both cases, in both states. But in general, she will serve her sentence in Idaho first. But I have to agree that it doesn't make justice for Charles any less important if, in fact, they're going to go forward with murder charges for him. I would have to do a deep dive into some research to find out whether or not Arizona could ask for Lori back to 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 impose the death penalty. And to be honest, right now, I am so deep into writing a book that I just am not going to take the time to figure that out right now. We're going to know that because if in fact the charges are death penalty eligible in Arizona, then we'll have to take a longer look at that. Right now, it's all a little bit speculation because the only thing we know is that one little entry we've seen in the court database that says premeditated murder in the first degree. So we don't know what that means in terms of what the actual charges coming out of the grand jury are. So with that, I think we are just about ready to take some questions. But I did look at everybody's response to should we move to Friday or should we stay on Wednesday? Pretty overwhelmingly, people like Wednesday. And so I think we're going to stick here. A lot of people pointed out that there are a lot of law tubers who are on Fridays, and us being on Wednesday means more opportunity to catch us live, and then more opportunity through the week to catch us on a replay. So I think we're going to stick with Wednesday. I do have a couple of other questions I'd love to hear your feedback on. There are a couple of other cases that have spark people's interest. Now, we have always focused, frankly, and very upfront on true crime. There are some other law tubers like, my Emily D. Baker, my mind just went for a minute, who do talk about some of the more high profile cases that are in the news. Now, we did talk somewhat about the Gwyneth Paltrow case. So I guess I'd love to hear from you all. There's a couple of cases that are getting to be pretty high profile. One has to do with the singer Lizzo and an accusation that she created a hostile work environment for her employees. And the other one is the Church of Scientology. Leah Remini has just recently filed a lawsuit against the Church of Scientology, claiming that they're harassing her, stalking her. So I'm kind of interested to hear if that is something that you all would like us to talk about as well. There are cases that we could take a look at if you all are interested. Emily D. Baker does a great job on these cases. So, if you are all okay with sticking with her while she kind of parses through those, then we won't do it. But I'd love to hear your ideas. Brian Koberger case is still sort of orbiting out there. It's going to be very interesting because his trial is set in October, and tick, 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 it's coming up really quickly. It was fascinating that after the prosecution asked him, if you have an alibi, we need to hear it. And they sort of said, no, well, we might tell you later. And the prosecution said, no, that's not good enough. You got to tell us now. It's what the statute says you have to do. Then they came back and said he was out driving around, because he did that a lot, driving around to clear his head. So their alibi is that he was out driving around alone and that there are no witnesses who could actually corroborate the fact that he was out driving around alone. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. It's going to go absolutely nowhere because that's not even a real alibi. So, but that trial is coming up. It is going to be up in Moscow, which is like 5 or 6 hours from me. I would very much like to attend some of that trial, particularly if we're going to be stuck again with some of the restrictions that happened in the Vallow case. it's interesting that that judge has been sort of watching how the Vallow case was handled and sort of looking at whether or not that could be a model for them. So we don't know yet. We don't have any information about whether or not that case is going to be live streamed, whether or not we're going to end up once again with nothing but audio or something in between. So, but I would definitely like to get up and at least at least take a look at the courthouse and sort of get a feel. I think that it is super important when I'm talking to all of you that I've actually physically been in that space and I can tell you what it's laid out like, where everybody's sitting, how big the courtroom is. I mean, you would be amazed at how small the Fremont County Courthouse is and how close everyone is to one another in that courthouse. That was very different from Lori's trial in Ada County, where they were in the biggest courtroom, they were spread out, they were sort of across the courtroom from one another. Lori was across the courtroom from the jury. I mean, all those things sort of add up to how we perceive the legal system going forward. So I am going to try and get up there depending on whether or not we're actually going to have a trial in October. It would be very quick to have a death penalty trial in October, but as we know from the Vallow case, stranger things have happened. So let's take some questions. Hi, Beth. I do want to remind everybody that we do have a Facebook group. It's called The Good Lori. It's in our show notes. And Michelle does post updates in there, and we'll be trying to post some more frequent updates once I'm a little bit less snowed under with book preparation. I will say that from a word count standpoint, I'm about halfway through, and so I'm pressing on writing every day. By the time the night comes around, I'm feeling pretty brain dead. So I appreciate y'all bearing with me. Beth, do you have an idea of how long it will be before Lori is transferred to Arizona and how long she'll be there before being transferred back to Idaho? Good questions. Any idea when the trial in Arizona will begin? Well, we don't know. If history's any example, Lori won't waive her speedy trial and they'll be going forward with a trial as quickly as they can. But we don't know what that looks like. So what we know is that a extradition motion has to go governor to governor. There are hoops that have to be jumped through, and ultimately she will be transported to Arizona. That could take 3 to 6 months. Once the extradition, this is amusing, once the extradition order is given, she is not going to get the same kind of treatment that she got when she was flown from Hawaii to Idaho. That's not happening. What will happen is that she will be put on a transport bus, and there is a circuit that the transport buses travel on. And they travel from state to state. They often stay over for short terms in local jails and prisons, but it could take weeks for that circuit. If she gets on the transport at the farthest point of the circuit, it could take weeks of riding on a bus to the next stop and exchanging prisoners and riding on the bus to the next stop. And they're not comfort coaches. They're like school buses. So it could be a long, miserable, especially if it's still summertime, trip for her. And it could take her weeks after the extradition order is signed to actually get to Arizona. Once she gets to Arizona, she'll be arraigned on the Arizona charges, and then her speedy trial period will start to run. And I honestly don't remember right now what the speedy trial period is in Arizona. Likely 6 months. So if the trial were to begin within that 6-month period, she probably wouldn't be back in Idaho until a year from now, a year from the time she's indicted. So it could be a long, really arduous couple of years for Lori. She's going to be pillar to post, doing the transport, doing the, it isn't going to be any picnic. And at the end of that, then she may very well be sentenced to the death penalty in Arizona, if in fact they've upgraded the charges to murder. So I have to slide up again. Why did... Wow, this is a really kind of interesting question, and I have an answer for you. My mother's first name is Delores, Delores, and the L is capitalized. All of my mother's siblings had D names, Delores, Devora, anyway. And my grandmother was a Deverne, believe it or not. And so when my mother was growing up, her name was Delores, and they called her Lori for short. Later, because her middle name was Anne, she started going by Annie instead. Oh, hello. We had a little blip there in our internet service, maybe. So hopefully we're back. We have had a little thunderstorm activity around Idaho, so that might be the culprit. So when I was born, she always liked Lori, and so I was named Lori. To make things even worse, my maiden name is Loring, Loring. So when I was growing up, I was Lori Loring. And for all my life, I was asked whether or not I was a typographical error. And one of my best friends was a kid named Steve Stevenson, because we could relate to one another. So that's the story of my name. It was Lori because my mom was a Delores and she liked it spelled Lori like her name. So great question. So, and I have 2 middle initials because I was married once before, and my first husband died, and I've always been very close to his family. So when I married my present husband, who I've been married to for 36 years, I kept my first married name as a middle name, sort of to leave an audit trail. Kathleen, question. John Thomas has been released from Lori's defense team. Will Archibald file her appeal, or will another lawyer do that? This is a great question. In most public defender offices, and Idaho is is the same. There is a separate section of the public defender's office that actually brings the appeal. There's an appellate division of the public defender's office. So John Thomas filed to be released out of the case. Jim Archibald was the lead attorney from the beginning. So it makes sense that he would continue, because the next thing that happens is that Archibald will, to the best of his ability, go back through the trial, and he will give the appellate lawyers an idea of what he thinks the issues are that come up on appeal. And there's sort of a appellate packet that the trial court lawyer forwards to the appeals division. So that is likely why Archibald is still on her case and will stay on until that appellate referral is made. Then the appeals lawyers will actually get a written transcript of the trial, and they will go through each day, each witness, and they will identify for themselves whether or not they identify other appellate issues that could come up. Now, as we've talked before, I think the speedy trial issue is probably going to be the best issue in terms of likelihood of succeeding. So we'll have to wait and see what other issues the appellate court comes up with. So the next process then would be for them to file a notice of their intent to appeal, and then that keeps the appeal window from closing, because you only have so long after the trial ends to file your appeal. So that starts that clock running, and then they will have the opportunity to file an opening brief, and that usually takes 6 months. And then the other side will which is also usually done by the appellate division of the Attorney General's office, will respond. And those appeals can take years. Literally, they take years to finally get to a trial date. And then because the appellate courts are so backed up, it could take another year or two to actually get on the court's calendar to have a hearing. So it's a long process. And in the meantime, Lori is going to be on the transport bus headed off to Arizona and having to deal with answering the charges in Arizona. So she's got regardless of what happens in her appeal, which could be years down the road, she's got a rough few years she's going to have to adjust. John and Carol. Wouldn't it be better if she served in a mental institution so those doctors can help her with her mental illness? Sure, it would have been. But she would have had to cooperate with a lot of mental health information that she was not willing to cooperate with. It is less likely that someone is actually going to be housed in a secure mental facility if they didn't bring a mental health defense. So the fact that she refused to bring a mental health defense, the fact that she refused to cooperate with any of the mental health assessments that were done in her pre-sentencing investigation, all of that is going to weigh against her being able to serve her sentence in a mental hospital. It is possible that she could be placed into a mental health pod or a mental health housing unit at the prison. And it would be possible that she could be hospitalized if she actually completely decompensates once she's in prison, which of course is always a possibility. The court authorized her to be forcibly medicated during the pendency of the trial. It's unlikely that she would be forcibly medicated once she's in prison. And that means it could very well be possible that she could have a major episode of decompensation. And that would delay Arizona. That would further delay any of her orientation into prison, could delay a lot of things. So it would be possible if she's merely receiving mental health medication and treatment, that could be done in the prison. But if she actually has a full-blown episode, then she probably would be transferred to a secure mental facility until she was stabilized, but she would be returning. My understanding is, and this is strictly off the record rumor, that her attorneys tried very hard to negotiate a deal that would have put her into a permanent life in a mental institution, and they were unable to reach that agreement. So, and that was prior to the death penalty being taken off the table, but we'll see how she fares in prison and whether or not they can meet her needs. Good questions, guys. Fun nasty. Do I think Lori will ever come around to media or public interviews? Yeah, I think she will. Yeah, I think she will because of the statements that she made at her sentencing. It's clear that she wants to tell her side of the story, and it was clear that from the phone calls that we heard with Summer and with Colby at her trial, that she was saying, you don't know the whole story, you can't understand, you don't know the whole story. I don't know. I think her attorneys may be able to keep her on a little shorter leash until the charges in Arizona are resolved. But I wouldn't even be shocked if she talked before those charges are resolved. It is really going to depend on what influence her Arizona lawyers have on her going forward. It's pretty clear that her Idaho public defenders didn't have much influence on her. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not a public defender in Arizona who might have a different personality, who might have a different way of relating to her, whether or not somebody else might find it easier or more, might be able to help her more based on her delusions. So, but I think she'll talk. Hi, Joanne. Well, we were just talking about this. The current charges, the charges for Charles, are conspiracy to commit murder, and they do not carry the death penalty. The death penalty is only available for murder. So conspiracy to commit murder in Idaho carries the death penalty, the same as if the underlying offense. But in Arizona, that's not the case. So in Arizona, the maximum sentence for conspiracy is life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. However, we did see something online in a little blurb that's in the filing of the extradition documents, suggestion that maybe that Arizona has upgraded those to premeditated first-degree murder. We don't know that that's for sure. None of us can see it on the database. If you recall, the indictments were sealed at one point, and so a lot of that is still being done because she's pre-indictment. They don't have to release that information. So once she gets to Arizona and gets indicted, we'll know more about whether or not she could face the death penalty. But it would require Arizona to increase the current charges to murder. Let's take a couple more questions, and we'll try and wrap up because I'm losing my voice. I have seasonal allergies and they impact my voice much more than my nose for some reason. So by the end of the day, I'm losing it. Hi, Kathy. Let's get to your question. I'm sorry if this question's already been answered, but why did John Thomas withdraw? I guess I didn't actually exactly answer that. Lawyers withdraw for a couple of different reasons. They can withdraw because they're asking the court to relieve them of their appointment to represent that person for a variety of reasons. There could be a conflict that's arisen. There could be irreconcilable differences between the lawyer and the client, so that relationship's broken down. It could be that if they're retained, their client's not paying their bill. All of those things are sort of the basis for withdrawal. But it's also a basis of withdrawal to go to the judge and say, Judge, my job's done. And that's, in fact, in this case, why John Thomas ask the court to relieve him of his appointment and for him to be allowed to withdraw. Jim Archibald has stayed on the case because somebody needs to forward that packet of appeal packet to the appellate division of the public defenders. So I'm sure that's what he's working on. And I am sure that at some point in the not too distant future, he'll be withdrawn as well, because he's a trial level attorney. He is not an appellate attorney, and the appellate division of the public defender will take over Lori's appeal. Similarly, the appellate division of the state attorney general will take over the appeal on behalf of the prosecution. So, guys, you ask such good questions because we've gotten beyond all the silly questions, and you guys are all too well educated. Carissa, say the Hellis attorney father guy, can't remember his name, I think it's Ronald, but I could be wrong, entirely confesses and tells where her remains are. Can he still not ever be charged again? That's right, he can never be charged. If tomorrow he were to sit down with law enforcement and say, here's how I did it, here's why I did it, here's where her body is, he can't be tried again, because jeopardy had attached at the time that the judge said there's not enough evidence here to convict him of this crime. So what happened was the prosecution brought the charges, they took it to trial. At the close of the prosecution's evidence, the defense said, Judge, we're moving for a directed verdict, a judgment of acquittal. And essentially what that is the judge saying, even if I believe everything the prosecution just said, there's not enough evidence to convict this man beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm not going to even let it go to the jury. And that's what happened, was the defense filed that motion and the judge granted it. At that point, the jury had been impaneled and legally jeopardy had attached. And so it would be double jeopardy for them to go back and charge him again with Halis's murder. So yes, this is the danger of prosecutors rushing to go to trial. And this was one of the reasons why people got so impatient with the prosecutors in the Vallow case. Now, we had a lot of delays having to do with COVID. I mean, we went through months of the court being closed down, not being able to convene grand juries, and all of those other things. But all that really did was give law enforcement more time to really cement their case. And a lot of people had a lot of frustration about how methodical the prosecution was about moving forward, bringing the lower charges and then kind of the charges after the children's bodies were found on tampering with evidence, and waiting until they could convene a grand jury and waiting. And a lot of people were pretty impatient about that. But this is the reason why, because it is possible for a judge to say, prosecution, you didn't meet your burden. And I cannot let the defense doesn't have to put on any evidence. And based on what I've seen so far, I can't send this to the jury and let them decide. So it's unfortunate. I feel bad for Alyssa's sister, Sarah. I'm sure that was not the outcome she'd hoped for. And, but I will say that I think some good things have come out of that. One is that Sarah has gotten connected up with some people within the true crime community who are big advocates for victims, including Carrie Rawson, who is BTK serial killer's daughter and is a huge advocate for the families of these bad actors. So she has been very interested and attentive to the family of Rex Heuermann, and she really has befriended a lot of people within the community who are in similar positions. So it's a little silver lining sometimes good things come out of those situations. Last question. Hi, Squeaky Wheel. Where is the wisdom in pushing Chad's trial out almost a year when much of the same evidence and witnesses will be used for his trial? Did John Pryor's whining finally wear Boyce down? No, I really don't think John Pryor's whining wore Judge Boyce down at all. I think the prosecution backed him into a corner where he had to give them more time. This was entirely on the prosecution. Now, y'all know I try and be fair, and I try and give credit where credit's due. I've even been known to say Judge Boyce did a good job. The prosecution did a lousy job at managing their discovery, and it was absolutely avoidable because they spent $3.4 million before this case, before any of them even saw the inside of a courtroom. Before the gavel hit the bench to open up Lori's trial, they had already spent well in excess of $3.4 million. Somewhere in that money should have been a low-level discovery clerk. You don't have to pay, you pay an administrative person whose only job is to make sure that they keep track of all of that voluminous discovery and make sure that it all gets to the defense. Every prosecutor's office has a system for how they account for every piece of discovery, every page. We used to bait stamp them. That was an old stamp that you stamped it and it advanced one number, and you stamped it again, and we numbered every piece of paper. Now it's all done digitally, but it's still done that way. And their prosecutors account for everything they send the defense so they can prove, Your Honor, we turned it over. That was not what happened here. What happened here was that they overlooked a substantial amount of discovery that there was no way that the defense could do their own independent investigation on between the time they got the discovery and the trial. Now, I once had a case set for trial, and the DA walked in and at the pretrial conference and handed me 6, this is how far it goes back, VCR tapes of interviews and information that had not been provided to me. It was hours. And this was like on Thursday afternoon. Trial was ready to start on Monday. And I had a conniption. And the judge looked at the defense attorney or the prosecution and said, where's this been for the last however long it had been? And my client was in custody, and it was a speedy trial issue. So guess what? My client got released. Now, the charges didn't get dismissed, but he got released from jail, and we got lots of extra time to go through all of those recordings. Now, that's a double-edged sword, because sometimes you go through the recordings and you think, oh, I'm going down in flames, because there's a lot of evidence here that makes my case bad. However, you've got to have the right to see that and know what is in it. So that's what happened in Chad's trial. We got almost up to literally to the day of trial, and the prosecution fessed up that they'd missed the discovery deadline and that they had hours of interview tapes and of jail phone calls that they had not turned over to the defense. Now, what the prosecution said is, oh, well, there's nothing in there, and we're not going to use it anyway. And the defense rightfully said, you don't get to make that call. I get to make that call as to whether or not there's anything important in that discovery. And I have to see it and decide whether or not there's anything in that discovery that could lead to finding new discovery or finding new information that is potentially exculpatory. So the judge really got backed into a corner. He did not have any choice at that point. He had to figure out how to penalize the prosecution for what amounted to sloppy work. So I don't think it was John Pryor's whining that wore him down. The judge said, I don't have any choice but to sever these trials because Lori had not waived her right to speedy trial. She had to go to trial. And her attorneys said, we're okay with that. It's an appellate issue. We can go back to the appeals court and say, we didn't get full discovery and we'll take it up on appeal because Lori wouldn't waive. But John Pryor's client had already waived. They've got all the time in the world. So he said, no, I want to push it out. It made perfect sense for him to push it out that far for a couple of reasons. One, because it gives him lots of time to review everything that came up in Lori's trial. That's why he wants a complete transcript of her whole trial, because now he gets to use any of that sworn testimony to impeach people if they get on the stand in Chad's case and tell a different story. But he also has the luxury of letting all of this die down so that it's more likely he's going to get a better jury. If he had had to try this case a few weeks after Lori's case, it would have all been fresh in the press's mind, fresh in the community's mind. A year from now, he's going to have much better chance of finding people who don't know anything about the case, who haven't heard anything about it, who didn't follow it, who don't care, than if it had been right away. So from his standpoint, it tactically made sense for him to try and get as much time as possible. But that whole deal was absolutely on the prosecution. And the judge took the death penalty off the table to penalize the prosecution for their sloppy work. Well, we've been at it about an hour and a half. I'm about to run out of voice. So maybe we ought to go ahead and wrap it up here. I want to thank everybody for being here. We've had 450 plus in the chat. So I'm really glad you joined us. I really appreciate it when I look through the comments, and I admit that I'm a little slow these days because I'm doing so much work on the computer otherwise. But I really love it when I look at the comments and y'all are so engaged, and I really enjoy it. I know that not everybody's comfortable hopping into our chat, but if you have a question or you want to leave me a comment, you can do it here in the YouTube comments section. And if you really want to have a direct conversation, email me. I do answer them, although I, once again, have been kind of tardy with it lately. So please do that. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for all your kind words, for your support. I just want to remind you all that all of your super chats and your PayPal donations go directly to our moderator, Michelle. And I know she appreciates it more than she could tell you. So I'm going to say good night. Thank you so much for joining us. If we didn't answer your question, please put it down below and we'll try and get to it. And in the meantime, have a great week. Have a great weekend. And I'll see you next week on Wednesday. Good night.